The Pacific had a way of warning you before it tried to kill you. Not with something obvious, no gunshot, no explosion, but with silence. A heavy, unnatural quiet that settled over the jungle like a blanket. We'd been on Peleliu long enough to know what that meant. Something was coming. Something bad. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That night, the moon was out, hanging low and swollen like it was watching us. I was in a shallow foxhole with Corporal Haynes, a farm kid from Kansas, who always seemed like he was supposed to be somewhere else on a tractor, maybe. Not on a scorched coral island halfway across the world. He'd chew the same piece of grass no matter what was happening. He wasn't chewing that night. The jungle ahead of us was just a black wall. No movement, no insects, no wind. I wiped sweat off my hands even though the rifle stock was already slick. The M1 Garand felt heavier than usual, like it knew what was about to happen. And so did we. Haynes leaned in. "You feel that?" I didn't answer. Because I did. Everyone did. When a Banzai charge was coming, the air got tight like the whole island was holding its breath. And then it happened. A single scream erupted from the tree line. Not a normal scream, something primal, high, stretched with madness and desperation. Then another, then a dozen more. And before the first one had finished echoing, the jungle exploded. They came pouring out like a living tide, silhouettes first, then the flash of steel, then the shapes of faces twisted with fury. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Close enough that you didn't need binoculars or imagination or courage. You needed speed. That was all. The first time you ever see a Banzai charge, your instincts betray you. Training tells you to aim, to align your sights, to steady your breathing. But against a screaming wave of men sprinting full speed with rifles and bayonets and grenades, aiming is suicide. That night is when I learned the truth Marines rarely wrote in letters home. If you hesitated long enough to aim your Garand, even for one breath, you were dead. The Japanese were 40 yards away when we fired the first shots. We didn't aim. None of us even thought about aiming. We fired from the shoulder, from the hip, from positions that would get you chewed out on any stateside rifle range. But war doesn't care about form. War cares about speed. The Garand bucked and jolted as I fired as fast as I could pull the trigger. The recoil blurred my vision, sweat stung my eyes, and muzzle flash lit the night like lightning. I remember the sound more than anything, 8 sharp cracks, fast and furious, then that cold metallic ping as the clip launched out. That sound used to bother me in training. It didn't that night. That night it meant one thing. Reload now or die. I slapped in. Another clip with shaking hands. Men around me were yelling. Not words, just sounds. The kind you make when your brain switches from thinking to surviving. The machine gun behind us opened up, a single hammering roar drowning out everything else. Tracers tore red lines across the dark as the Japanese crashed forward. They hit our wire like a wave, smashing into rocks. Some got tangled and kept fighting even as they were trapped, slashing and stabbing and screaming curses in a language we didn't understand. Others leapt over bodies and broken stakes, using their own dead as ladders. The smell of sweat, dirt, smoke, and blood mixed into something you never forget. I fired again. Not up at sights, not down the barrel, just firing into shapes and movement and shadows, because that's all there was time for. The Garand kicked, the clip pinged again, hands shaking. Another reload. At some point I realized I was screaming too, maybe to drown the terror, maybe to drown the chaos, or maybe because my mind had simply surrendered to instinct. The thing people misunderstand about the Garand is this. It wasn't accurate fire that stopped a Banzai charge. It was volume, rhythm, muscle memory. Aimed fire belonged to daytime patrols and controlled firefights. Night charges were something else entirely raw, close, immediate. If you tried to place careful shots, you were simply feeding your place in the line to the enemy. The Japanese got within 10 yards before our fire began to finally break their momentum. 10 yards. That's a few long steps. I could see their faces in the muzzle flashes, eyes wide, mouths open, sweat and dirt streaked across skin. One stumbled over a corpse and kept coming on his hands and knees until a burst from the machine gun dropped him mid-crawl. Finally, the charge started to falter. Bodies piled, screams turned into moans, then into silence. And just like that, the jungle went quiet again, except for the heavy panting of Marines trying to remember how to breathe. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the rifle. Haynes sat back in the foxhole and let out a shaky laugh, the kind you make when you're alive but don't quite believe it. Somewhere down the line a Marine was vomiting. Someone else was crying. Officers were shouting for ammo counts. When the moon slid behind a cloud, the only light came from the glowing tips of cigarettes. Marines swore they'd quit. A few minutes passed before anyone dared speak louder than a whisper. Haynes nudged me again. "Still think aiming matters?" he said with a tired grin. Because the truth was simple, brutal, undeniable. That night, and every night after, Marines didn't fire the M1 Garand like riflemen. We fired it like a lifeline. Fast, hard, unaimed, unhesitating. Because against a Banzai charge, survival wasn't about precision, it was about speed or being swallowed whole. The first wave had come and gone like a nightmare, a blur of movement, fire, and instinct, but the night wasn't over, not by a long shot. We all knew Banzai charges didn't come as singles, they came like tides. One crashed against you, testing your line, the next tried to break it. The one after that aimed to finish what the others started. And if you were still alive after all of them, well, that was just luck mixed with a little stubborn Marine refusal to die. My hands were still shaking from the last rush. The metal of the Garand felt hot, almost alive, like it remembered things I didn't want to think about yet. Empty shell casings lay all around my foxhole, glinting in the thin moonlight like scattered teeth. The air stank of burnt powder and churned up coral dust. A man doesn't forget that smell. It stays with you, buried deep, rising up years later when you least expect it. Haynes was breathing hard beside me, his chest rising and falling like he'd run miles. His helmet was tilted back, and sweat ran down his face, in slow, muddy streaks. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both knew it wasn't over. You could feel the next wave forming somewhere in the tree line, even before you heard it. The machine gun team behind us was cursing softly as they swapped barrels and cleared jams. One of them, I think it was Dobbs, the skinny kid from Chicago, kept repeating, "They're coming again, they're coming again," over and over, like he was trying to convince the darkness. A flare shot up somewhere off to our left. It burst in the sky with a soft pop and washed the jungle in an ugly red glow. For a second, we saw shapes moving just beyond the foliage, not clear, but enough to make your stomach turn. They were regrouping, reforming lines, tightening grips on rifles and bayonets, preparing themselves the way we were trying to. This was the part nobody ever talks about. The waiting, the quiet between storms. It was worse than the charge itself. During the attack, fear had no room to grow. You were too busy firing, reloading, ducking, reacting. But in the stillness between waves, fear expanded. It pressed on your ribs, crawled up your spine, dug its nails in, and whispered, "This might be the one that gets you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And yet, in that terrible quiet, something else happened too, something that changed the way we fought. It was the moment I realized that my hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, ready, almost eager. The Garand sat against my shoulder like an old friend who didn't need explanation. I knew, without thinking, exactly how fast I could bring it up, fire, drop it back down, reload, and fire again. That's when it clicked. I wasn't aiming anymore, not in the traditional sense. My eyes weren't searching for front sight posts and perfect alignment. My body already knew where the muzzle would be. All that training, all those drills, all those hours on the range, they had carved something deeper than conscious thought. The next scream came sudden and sharp, not one voice this time, but several, overlapping like tearing metal. The jungle exploded. They burst out of the shadows with rifles raised, bayonets gleaming, bodies low and fast, not running, charging, minds set, death accepted, momentum unstoppable, and I didn't aim. I didn't even think about aiming. I stood halfway up in the foxhole, tucked the butt of the Garand into the crook of my arm, and fired from the shoulder without lifting my cheek to the stock. The first shot cracked through the air, bright and deafening. The second came half a heartbeat later, and the third seemed to fire itself. My world narrowed to movement, muzzle flash, and recoil. Haynes was firing too, not the slow, careful shots we learned in boot camp, but fast ones, almost wild, except they weren't wild at all. They were precise in their own chaotic way, guided by instinct and repetition, rather than a clean sight picture. Japanese silhouettes stumbled in the moonlight as our fire cut into them, but more appeared from behind, climbing over their fallen comrades. Some came so close I could see their eyes wide, determined, not afraid. That's something people don't understand about the Japanese infantry. They didn't charge out of madness. They charged out of belief, out of doctrine, out of a commitment to a code older than any island we fought on. One reached the lip of the foxhole. Bayonet raised. My rifle was empty. I heard the telltale ping, so I shoved the muzzle forward with both hands and cracked it into his jaw. He fell backward in a spray of blood and dust. I jammed a fresh clip in, slammed the bolt shut with a metallic snap, and fired again before he even hit the ground. To this day, I don't know how many rounds I fired in that second wave. Time worked differently. It stretched and collapsed, folding in on itself like wet paper. All I knew was that I kept pulling the trigger, kept operating the rifle like it was part of my own body, and the wave eventually began to thin. The screaming grew scattered, the shapes in the dark grew fewer. Movement slowed, staggered, and then stopped. A final straggler crawled forward, dragging himself through coral dust until a machine gun rattled and kept him down for good. And then, silence again. Not peace, just a temporary pause, like the islands themselves were watching to see who would fall next. Haynes let out a long breath and slumped back against the sandbag wall of the foxhole. I could barely hear him over the ringing in my ears when he muttered, "You notice it too?" "Notice what?" I asked, wiping sweat from my palms. "That you ain't aiming any more." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because he was right. None of us were. And somehow, that was exactly why we were still alive. The screams burst out of the darkness like someone had torn a hole straight through the night. One moment the jungle was silent. The next it was alive, with voices, hundreds of them, shrieking, chanting, pounding the earth as they came. You don't forget that sound. You can't. A Banzai charge wasn't just noise. It was intention, pure and violent. It told you everything in one breath. We are coming. We will not stop. We aren't afraid to die. And in that instant, every memory of rifle, ranges and marksmanship lectures and perfect stances vanished. Your body didn't care about theory. It cared about survival. My fingers locked around the handguard of the Garand, and there was no thought of aiming, none. Just the weight of the rifle, the familiar roughness of the stock, and the sense that the night itself was rushing straight toward me. The first shapes broke out of the tree, line shadows at first, then bodies, rifles raised, bayonets gleaming, helmets bobbing as they sprinted. Full tilt. They were close already. Too close. They were always too close. Someone down the line opened fire, one shot, then another, and then the whole perimeter erupted. The island lit up with muzzle flashes, tracers slicing red across the dark, the machine guns rattling in a deep metallic growl. I didn't even remember making the decision. My Garand was already in motion, lifted, pressed into my shoulder just enough to brace. And then the trigger broke. One shot, another, a third. The recoil jolted through my arms, and somewhere between the fourth and fifth round, the conscious part of me stepped aside, and something older took over. Something faster. I wasn't aiming at heads or chests or even silhouettes. I was firing at movement, at the blur of shapes, at the spot where the shrieks were loudest. Haynes beside me was doing the same, leaning forward, teeth clenched, firing as quickly as he could work the trigger. The air between us glowed orange with muzzle flash after muzzle. Flash. Dirt kicked up in front of us where rounds hit the coral. The air shook with the impact of grenades exploding farther down the line. And still they came. You can't understand how fast a Banzai hits unless you've lived through one. They were 20 yards away, then 10, then 5. Faces contorted, eyes wide, rifles raised high, some crouched low with bayonets thrust forward like spears. I remember one man in front, shirt open, chest heaving, bayonet leveled directly at me as he sprinted. I don't remember lifting the rifle higher, but I remember the blast, and he fell so close I could have touched him. The ping of the empty clip snapped me back to the present. That little sound, the one people joke about, the one the movies exaggerate, it was real and sharp in moments like that. But I didn't freeze. By that point, none of us did. My hand moved without permission. Down to the pouch, fingers closing on another clip. Slam it home, bolt forward, fire again. The line held. We were breathless by the time the screams faded and the jungle returned to that eerie, hesitant quiet. Bodies lay twisted in piles in front of us. Some collapsed on top of each other where momentum carried them too far. My hands were shaking, but not with fear, with adrenaline burning so hot it made my fingertips numb. Haynes spat out his chewed stem of grass and muttered something about Kansas wheat fields being quieter than this. It was the first hint of humour anyone had made in hours, and it didn't feel real. What I learned that night, and on 100 nights like it was simple, the M1 Garand wasn't a precision instrument in battle like this. It was an instinct weapon. You didn't aim. You reacted. You fired fast, controlled, and low. Marines figured out quickly that a Banzai charge didn't require headshots or heroics. It required volume steady, unhesitating volume that hit the mass of the attack, broke its momentum, and turned a wave into scattered fragments. Once, the wave lost its speed. It lost everything. The next morning brought a sun that felt indecently bright. The battlefield looked different in daylight, quieter, sadder. War is loud at night and shamefully silent in the morning. Officers walked the perimeter, taking notes, counting casualties. Corpsmen moved like ghosts, checking the wounded, tagging the dead, and we just sat there, eating cold rations, exhausted, watching the surf far beyond the ridge as though it belonged to another world entirely. Haynes nudged me with his boot, nodding toward my rifle. "You noticed something about how you fired last night?" he asked. "Besides the fact I don't remember half of it," he grinned. "That's the whole point. You didn't think, and that's why you're still here." He wasn't wrong. Weeks passed, islands changed, terrain changed, commanders changed, but the rhythm of combat didn't. Every Marine learned it sooner or later. When the screaming began, when the ground shook, when the charging line of bodies poured forward like a flood, aiming was suicide. You held the rifle where it naturally fell. You shot where the movement was thickest. You kept firing until the rifle clicked empty, then you reloaded by feel in the dark. And it wasn't panic. People like to imagine troops spraying wildly. No, it was controlled desperation, trained by repetition, refined by necessity. We didn't fire without aiming, because we were careless. We did it because we understood that survival depended on reflexes faster than thought. One night on Okinawa, long after I'd stopped keeping track of dates, the Japanese hit us harder than usual. Multiple waves, screams that came in layers. The ground trembled under boots and explosions. It felt endless. I remember sweating so much my hands slipped on the rifle's wood. I remember my vision narrowing. I remember dumping clip after clip without ever seeing a sight picture. And I remember, at some point, realizing that the only thing keeping the line together was the steady, relentless beat of Garands firing up and down the ridge, fast, rhythmic, almost mechanical. After the final wave broke, the firing tapered off slowly. First the machine guns, then the BARs, then the Garands, like a storm passing from the far edge of the island inward. For a moment, everything fell silent except for the clicking of cooling metal. One of the new replacements collapsed into his foxhole and asked in a shaking voice how we managed to hit anything if none of us were aiming. Haynes, battered but unbroken, took a deep breath and answered for all of us. "You aim before the charge," he said. "You prepare, you think, you plan. But once they come, once they start that mad rush, you don't aim, you survive. That's how Marines do it." Years later, long after the war, long after the islands people liked to ask about the battles, they wanted the clean versions, the technical details, the rifle specs, the distances, the maneuvers. They wanted to know if the Garand was truly the best rifle in the war, or why Marines fired so fast, or whether the ping sound ever gave us away. I answered when I could, laughed when appropriate, but the real truth was simpler than any explanation I could give. We fired without aiming because the enemy left us no choice. We fired without aiming because hesitation was fatal. We fired without aiming because instinct is faster than fear, and fear is faster than thought. And the M1 Garand. God bless that rifle. It never let us down. Some memories fade with time, but others stay etched into you. The smell of cordite, the heat of the tropics, the weight of the Garand, the screams before a charge, the silence afterward, and above all, the knowledge that on those nights, those chaotic, terrifying nights, when the world narrowed to a few feet of dirt and jungle, you fought with every part of yourself, not just your hands, not just your training, but your instincts, the ones that told you, don't stop, don't think, just keep firing. That is why Marines stopped Banzai charges in seconds, not because we were better marksmen, but because we learned, the hardest possible way, that sometimes survival depends on trusting your body to act before your mind can catch up. And that is how the Garand earned not just its reputation, but our absolute faith. We didn't sleep much after the charge. Nobody ever slept well after one. The jungle stayed dark for hours, but our eyes stayed darker. You keep seeing shapes long after they're gone. You keep hearing footsteps that aren't there. You keep waiting for someone to scream that awful, terrible scream that begins a Banzai. But nothing came. Just the slow drip of the trees and the quiet shift of bodies settling in the dirt. The sky was beginning to pale when Lieutenant Morgan climbed up the ridge, boots scraping against coral, sweat and dust smeared across his face. He looked like a man carrying a secret no one should have to hold. He squatted next to me and tapped my shoulder. "You did good last night, Marine," he said softly. "You all did." "Didn't feel like good," I replied. "It never does," he muttered. "But you held." And that was the simple truth. We held because that's what Marines did out there. We held when we didn't know how. We held when we were scared. We held when the odds were wrong, when the numbers didn't make sense, when the enemy thought momentum alone could break us. We held because the alternative wasn't an option. He stood, gave me a nod, and walked down the ridge toward the rest of the platoon. The sun crept higher, soft orange bleeding through the trees. That morning light always looked too gentle for a place like that, too calm, too clean for the world we had become part of. I climbed out of the foxhole and stretched my back. Everything hurt. The ground was still warm from the fighting. My boots crunched on broken coral and empty clips. The Garand leaned against a piece of shattered tree trunk, dusted in ash and mud but still solid, still ready. I picked it up and felt a familiar weight settle into my hands. My rifle had become something more than a tool, almost a part of me, like an extension of my instincts, something that responded before thought could catch up. Aim? In a charge? No. You moved the barrel where it needed to go, and you fired because there was no time for anything else. That's what saved us. Men were gathering down by the shallow slope leading toward the beach. Corpsmen were working quietly, kneeling beside those we lost. Names were read softly, carefully, as if saying them too loud might break something fragile in the air. A few of the new boys we had gotten 2 days earlier were gone. They never had a chance to grow old in the war the way some of us had. War ages you in different ways. Some grow older in their bones, some in their minds, but the ones who die young, they age the fastest of all. They become part of the story before they ever get to finish their own. I walked along our line, checking on the boys' Haines, slumped against a rock, chewing on a piece of grass like always. O'Reilly, sitting cross-legged with a dented canteen, staring off into the trees. Jenkins, cleaning his BAR, even though the barrel had cooled hours ago. We all acted like we were fine. Marines always act like they're fine. But when you looked closer, you could see the tremor beneath the calm, the quiet knowledge that last night could have gone differently. Around midday, we got word that the Japanese who launched the attack had been part of a larger force moving through the island, searching for weak points. They expected us to break. They always did. And sometimes we feared the same. But their belief in the power of a charge met something they never accounted for. Marines who refused to give ground and a rifle that didn't need perfect aim to deal perfect consequences. By late afternoon, we were ordered to move out. The ridge was secured. For now, we packed our gear, tightened our straps, and formed up in a rough line. You could feel the exhaustion in every step, but also a strange sense of momentum. Surviving a night like that doesn't make you fearless. It just teaches you the shape of your own fear. As we pushed deeper into the brush, the jungle opened into a clearing, where the breeze carried the smell of seawater and hibiscus. Unreal how beautiful the Pacific could look right after trying to kill you. I remember thinking, if the world could see this place without the war, maybe they'd never imagine what happens here in the dark. We marched on. Hours passed. The sun dropped lower, shadows lengthening across the ground. And just when the light turned that deep, warm gold, the kind that makes the whole island glow, we stopped at a ridge overlooking the western shore. Waves rolled in slow, steady rhythm. A few landing craft were anchored offshore, bobbing in the tide. The lieutenant told us to rest. Tomorrow, we'd push inland again. Another ridge, another valley, another fight waiting somewhere in the trees. None of us asked what came next, we already knew. That was the rhythm of island fighting. Push, hold, survive. Push, hold, survive again. Day after day until someone back home declared the island secured. I sat down on a flat slab of coral, wiped the grime off my hands, and rested the Garand across my lap. I looked at that rifle the way you look at an old friend. Not with affection, but with understanding. The kind of understanding forged only in fear and necessity, because by then, every Marine knew. When the Japanese came screaming through the trees, when the night lit up with muzzle flashes and the air filled with fire and steel, you didn't aim. You reacted. You trusted your instincts. You trusted your rifle. And somehow, you lived to see the morning. The sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned red. And we sat there quietly, letting the wind wash over us. Another night was coming. Another test. Another chance to survive or vanish into the island. And as darkness settled in, I tightened my grip on the Garand, felt its weight steady my breath, and whispered a thought I didn't dare speak aloud. If they come again, we'll be ready. Even if ready was only another word for determined. Even if determined was just another word for scared. Even if scared was the only honest truth any of us had left. The next morning, when the sun finally pushed its way above the tree line, the battlefield looked unreal, like something painted by a madman who had run out of colours and started mixing everything together. Smoke drifted low across the ground, moving like slow fog. Spent brass glinted everywhere, piled in little golden dunes around every foxhole. And the bodies. There were so many that the heat had already started its work. Respect. Respect was something you felt in quiet churches or on your grandmother's porch, not after a night like that. No, this was something different. More like disbelief mixed with exhaustion, all of it wrapped in a numbness so deep your own heartbeat felt far away. I leaned against my foxhole wall, my hands black with soot, my fingers cramped from gripping the Garand so long they were shaped like the stock. My shoulder throbbed from recoil. My ears rang. My throat was raw from shouting without realizing it. And still, I felt something else too. A kind of confusion, almost shameful to admit. I couldn't remember half of what I had done. Pieces, flashes, fragments, yes. The screams, the shapes rushing out of the dark, the way the muzzle flash lit up the world like stuttering lightning. But the actual firing? The aiming, or rather, the not aiming. It was instinct. Pure survival. A kind of mechanical fury my body took over while my mind hid somewhere deep inside. Haynes climbed out of his foxhole beside me, wincing as he stretched his back. "Hell of a thing," he muttered, looking over the carnage. "Whole damn night gone, just like that." But what he said next stuck with me more than anything. "You remember how you fired?" I shook my head. "Not really." "Good," he said. "Means you did it right." I frowned. "Right?" He pointed at my rifle, still hot enough near the barrel to shimmer in the sunlight. "That's the trick no one teaches you. Night fighting, close fighting. You don't aim. You let that rifle talk for you. If you remember too much, you aimed too slow." He said it casually, but I could tell he meant every word. And when I looked around, really looked, I saw it everywhere. The positions of the bodies, the patterns of the brass, the black scars of powder on the ground. You could almost see the story written in the dirt. Every Marine had fought from muscle memory, from raw instinct, firing not at shapes, but at sound, at motion, at the rhythm of survival. And that's when it fully sank in. The M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle in the Pacific, it was an extension of your nerves, a reflex, a lifeline. Later that day, the officers walked the line and spoke quietly with each squad, making sure we were still alive, still functional, still able to move. A few of the men were shaking uncontrollably combat stress, though we had no real word for it at the time. Some stared blankly at nothing. Some joked too loudly, too quickly, the humour brittle as glass. But all of us had one thing in common. We knew that if another Banzai came that night, the only reason we'd survive wasn't discipline or training, it was instinct and firepower. As the sun climbed higher, the heat turned unbearable. The stench grew thicker. We were ordered to police the field, gather ammunition, redistribute what we could salvage. The mortarmen buried their shells. The machine gunners cleaned their barrels. The corpsmen tagged the wounded and the dead. And through all of it, I kept thinking about what we had learned, not because someone taught us, but because the battlefield forced it onto us like a brand. You didn't aim a Garand during a Banzai charge. You moved it. You swept it. You fired so fast the rifle itself became your only awareness, your only shield against the chaos rushing toward you. That day, as we dug in again, knowing nightfall might bring another scream out of the jungle, I realized something I had never admitted to myself. It wasn't bravery that kept us alive. It wasn't accuracy. It wasn't tactics. It was something far simpler, far more primal. The speed at which you accepted that aiming was a luxury you could no longer afford. And once you understood that, once you let go of the old rules and became part of the rhythm of that brutal island, the Garand became more than a rifle. It became the thin line between living long enough to see another sunrise and being swallowed by the dark. By dawn, the air smelled like burnt powder and coral dust, and every one of us looked like we'd aged 10 years in a single night. No one talked at first, not because we were trying to be respectful or dramatic, no. It was because none of us could quite believe we were still alive. My ears were still ringing, my hands still trembling. The Garand felt almost fused to my palms, like it had become part of me during the night and wasn't ready to let go. The sun was just creeping over the ridge when Lieutenant Marlowe finally walked the line, stepping around bodies, ours and theirs, like a man moving through a nightmare he didn't want to disturb. He didn't compliment us, didn't say, "Well done," didn't even nod. He just looked at each Marine for a brief moment, checking to see if we were still in one piece, still breathing, still holding on somewhere inside. When he got to me, he paused. "You fired a lot," he said quietly. I felt the muscles in my forearm twitch. "Didn't have time to aim, sir." He nodded once, slow, like he was confirming something he already knew. "That's good," he said, "because that's what kept this damn line from collapsing. But I wasn't proud. Not then, not for a long time. Because when someone charges you screaming, when they're 10 feet away, maybe 5, Maybe one you don't think about marksmanship or accuracy or doctrine. You think about living, and living means firing as fast as the rifle will let you. Living means instinct kicking in long before your brain does. Living means the M1 becomes a reflex instead of a tool. We had ammunition runners come up from the rear that morning, each one wide-eyed at the sight of what was left. They passed out clips with shaking hands, looking over their shoulders like another wave might come crashing out of the trees any second. One of them, a kid with freckles and sweat dripping from his helmet strap, stared at my rifle. "You burned through all of that in one night?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just took the clips and slid them into my cartridge belt, trying not to notice how my hands shook. I'd fired so fast, so long, so blindly, that the steel of the barrel still radiated leftover heat in the morning air. Someone down the line started laughing, not a healthy laugh, not a joyful one, the brittle, cracked kind that comes from surviving something you shouldn't have. A few others joined in because sometimes laughter's the only thing holding back whatever else sits behind it. But Haynes didn't laugh. He sat on the edge of his foxhole, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground like something down there had the answers he needed. I sat beside him without saying a word. For a while we just breathed, listening to the crackle of burning brush and the distant echo of sporadic gunfire somewhere across the island. Finally, he spoke. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What?" "That we didn't even see half the guys we shot. We just fired where the noise was." I stayed quiet. He shook his head slowly. "They came so damn fast, man, like shadows that suddenly had bodies." I knew exactly what he meant. Aimed fire belongs in training manuals, in firing ranges, in clean peacetime instruction sheets, written by men who've never had someone sprint at them with a bayonet in the dark. But hip-fire wild, rapid, desperate that was real. That was what kept us breathing. Around noon, a burial party arrived to move the bodies, and the smell changed from gunpowder to something heavier, something the island heat made even worse. We didn't help, not because we were unwilling, but because we were ordered to rest, hydrate, clean weapons, and stay alert. The corpsman gave us salt tablets and checked our pupils with tired eyes. Later, after a can of lukewarm rations and a few swallows of water that tasted like metal, Marlowe returned with new orders. Hold. Position. Expect more activity after sundown. The Japanese rarely attacked just once. They probed, re-evaluated, then tried again from a different angle. Haynes sighed as he wiped down his rifle. "Guess we're not done." "No," I said. "Not by a long shot." He looked at me. Then at the tree line, the same one that erupted hours earlier with screams and shadows and gunfire. "You ready if they do it again?" I slid a fresh clip into the Garand, felt the solid click, and let out a slow breath. "Doesn't matter if I'm ready," I said. "Just matters that the rifle is." He laughed once at that, the kind of dry, exhausted laugh that comes only when a man's body is running on fumes. When night finally came again, the jungle returned to its unnatural silence. The moon hid behind clouds this time, giving the ridge and the brush below a darker, heavier feel. The air grew thick, hard to breathe, like it wanted to warn us without saying a word. I knew what that meant. We all did. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, beyond the shadows, men were gathering again. Men who would scream and rush and try to tear us apart before we could think, before we could even lift the rifle properly. But this time, there was no fear rising in me, only readiness, only instinct, only the memory of survival. And the weight of the Garand sitting against my knee loaded, warm, obedient, like a living heartbeat waiting for the next storm. They say a man doesn't really understand his own heartbeat until it's the only sound he has left. That was me, crouched behind a blasted palm stump, sweat stinging my eyes, listening to nothing but that heavy thud inside my chest. The charge had broken hours earlier, but the night wasn't finished with us. The Japanese never truly retreated. They melted into the dark, circling, waiting for the moment you let your breath out too slowly. Haynes and I stayed low, staring into the tangle of underbrush ahead. The moon had dipped behind a cloud, leaving the whole ridge in a kind of bruised twilight. Every shadow looked like a rifle barrel, Every leaf that twitched might have been a man testing his luck. "What do you think?" Haynes whispered. "I think they're watching us the way wolves watch a wounded deer," I said. He grunted, wiped his palms on his trousers, and leaned his garand against his knee. We could both feel it, the next push, the next mad rush, the next moment where instinct would have to take over again. No aiming, no thinking, just reaction. A twig snapped far off to the right, another behind us. The jungle was talking. I raised my rifle slowly, not to aim, but to ready my body. You learn to read the dark out here. You learn its silences, its lies, its small betrayals. And somewhere beyond that murk, we heard the faint sound of movement, deliberate, steady, closing in. Haynes whispered, "They're sneaking this time." I nodded, tightening my grip. Charging won't work anymore. Somewhere in that jungle, a voice barked a word I didn't understand. The brush ahead of us shifted, and the night exploded open once more. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.